Battlefield 6 has taken the world by storm. In less than a week, the open beta has become the most played beta in Steam history, overtaking Monster Hunter Wilds at 500,000 players, and has also managed to go past the overall player count for Call of Duty HQ on Steam. These are very impressive feats considering that Battlefield, much like Call of Duty, exists on a separate app like the EA app, and also the number of console players must have been absolutely mind-blowing. So we're seeing some pretty new heights for this franchise, and as somebody who has been playing this game since days gone, Battlefield 2, Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4, I have had a lot of fun in the Battlefield 6 beta. And I've managed to achieve 38 and a half hours between the game going live on Thursday and it shutting down on Sunday. Granted, some of that was recording random stuff for future content, but still enough time that I feel I can finally make a valid assessment of where the game is at. And on top of that, I've also been playtesting Battlefield 6 for quite some time now. I'm actually able to publicly say that we were invited to playtest and give feedback on Battlefield 6 quite some time ago, and honestly, even seeing some of these maps out in the wild now that have been changed quite significantly and completely renamed. For example, Cairo used to be called Abbasid. And with all of this in mind, I feel like I can really give an honest assessment of where Battlefield 6 is, where it's at, and where it needs to be in order to be a successful game. Don't get me wrong, this game is a lot of fun, and I've had a phenomenal time. But with Battlefield 6, the devil is in the details. There are elements of the game that need serious addressing for the long-term health of this game and the franchise, and some of those things are already being addressed. Sniper glints are being toned down, the shotgun is being nerfed, red dots are having their illumination increased so you can actually see where you're shooting, and you won't be able to do things like dual-wielder stinger and RPG. But there is a lot more that can make or break this game being something like a 7 out of 10 and something like a 9 or 10 out of 10. The beta on the surface has been incredibly successful, and for me probably sits somewhere around an 8.5, but that's under the context and pretense that some of these issues get resolved and changed. If this game were to release with the issues that it has right now on day one, I think that would really drag that back into something more like a 7, and could make the future gameplay loop of Battlefield 6 quite frustrating. We're going to start off with the menus, the UI, and the default settings and customizable HUD. The menus for this game are not fantastic. Honestly, I really don't like this sort of pivot towards Hulu-style menu design, and I have no idea what this game is going to look like when we have multiplayer, single-player, Portal, and then potentially the Battle Royale all in the same menu tray with their own subset of modes, matchmaking, and possibly even server browsing. It reminds me very dramatically of Modern Warfare 2 when they decided to move to something that looked a little bit more like a TV dashboard, and it just doesn't work very well. I understand that this is obviously to cater towards some people who are playing on larger displays like TVs and consoles, but I still feel like this can be refined into a much more simpler palette that could just look better. But that's not even my biggest gripe. Moving into settings and the UI elements, this whole thing is a mess. Now, granted, I will give the developers credit. Battlefield 6 has a plethora of options to choose from to customize the experience to exactly how you need it to be. But the actual menu experience is a nightmare. There are controller settings in 3 different menus, there are essential settings that are buried behind different sections, and the whole thing's just a mess. I'm going to use the controller as an example for this, although this does apply to other parts of the game, like keyboard and mouse, like the UI elements, like the HUD, where things just don't make sense. Like, in the controller settings, you have to customize your presets and your layouts, but important settings like dead zones are buried away in an entire separate menu system. There are 7 or so different options for aim acceleration curves ranging from Bad Company 1 to Battlefield 1. Your sensitivity sliders for vehicles, infantry, and pretty much everything else seem to be buried away into entirely different subsections, and all of it just creates this gargled mess that takes, in my view, about half an hour to get anything working properly. And some of these settings make no sense at all. Default settings in this game come out of the box with incorrect values. Vertical aim ratio being set to 40 makes 0 sense for anybody who's on a 16:9 display. Likewise, the aim coefficient being 133 is a value that was intended for 4:3 displays, and the actual correct value for anybody using a monitor or TV on a 16:9 display is 178. Now, it's great that we can customize and change these options, but if you know that I'm using a 27-inch 1440p monitor and I'm playing on a controller, The default value out of the box should just be 178. Setting them to the defaults that make sense for the modern era of video gaming, really basic thing that should just happen from day one. Like the basic settings that come out of the box for Battlefield 6 just in terms of controls, let alone keyboard and mouse and UI, are really not in a great space, and it's something that I hope they work on. And to add to that, important settings like, your dead zones being buried in the controller tuning segment at the very bottom of the menu make no sense. The entire setup for the entire setting system for this game could be completely refined and streamlined to allow very obvious pages for the important settings that you need on day one, and then an advanced tab to tweak some of the more important stuff for players. But the fact that there are about 6 to 10 different pages just for controller settings alone is complete lunacy. Moving on to the HUD and UI customization, this is fantastic. I'm really glad to see this coming back. But it would be nice to see the compass enabled by default, and it would be nice to have some more classical options of Battlefield, like moving the objectives to above the minimap, or moving the compass to above the minimap. And more importantly, being able to move the minimap completely to different corners of the screen. These are really nice to haves that would greatly improve the overall experience, because most people, I would say, actually look for their minimap in the top left corner of the screen. Let's talk about matchmaking next. Now, matchmaking in Battlefield 6 is good because it doesn't have any skill-based matchmaking, and that much is very clear to me. I've had games where I am sweating it out, dropping 80, 90, 100 kills and finishing top of the leaderboards, and other games where I'm just being completely curb-stomped. The skill-based experience in this game is completely random, and it does just seem to be team balancing to make sure that there is some degree of balance between one team and the other across all different skill levels. The problem with matchmaking is that sometimes I would find myself playing Siege of Cairo 5 times in a row, often defending every single time, or attacking every single time. Whatever the matchmaking parameters are for Battlefield 6 in terms of getting you into different maps and experiences, and also in terms of getting you into different teams so that you can defend or attack, it just seems to be a complete mess. And also, if I'm being entirely honest with you, it actually is fundamentally flawed. Take, for example, me as a very high-caliber player. And this isn't just me stroking my ego, but, I tend to finish top of the leaderboards most of the time in the game for captures, kills, things like that. Just general persistence. I often found that in the breakthrough experience, I was very regularly put on attack because the game tried to level out the teams between the two teams to make sure that there was somebody decent on each side, and it ultimately meant that I think the majority of my breakthrough experiences were spent on attack rather than defending. And it just makes me wonder what kind of background decision-making is being made in order to get people into matches, and how much you're going to end up playing the same experiences over and over again. It's great that there is no skill-based experience in Battlefield 6. It's great that it feels like you can kind of relax a little bit and still have a good time, which is probably the biggest issue I have with modern shooters today. But the fact that there are no persistent server experiences with an official rule set makes no sense to me. It feels like such a big open goal. Now, I understand that Battlefield is doing this so that they can spool up instances of the game and spool them down in quick succession, which arguably is probably making them a very large server saving cost. And I think we can all agree that dynamically, those guys did a really good job of making sure that you could get into the game through the queue fairly quickly, even if it was a fairly large queue. And server stability generally seemed fantastic for a beta that was so overwhelmingly played. At launch, I'm fairly confident we're going to have the ability to filter by modes, filter by maps, and try and get the experiences that we want in matchmaking. But a simple solution to all of this is just to bring back a server browser that has a combination of official experiences hosted by EA and DICE, and then a combination of user-hosted experiences, like, for example, a combined ARM server. Let's say, for example, I say, do you know what? I'm not a big fan of the infantry maps. I want maps where only you guys can have vehicular-based experiences on some of the larger launch maps. I could call that the Tactical Brits Combined Arms server. I would happily rent that server from EA for a cost, and it would be included in the official browser set for the server browser because it has an official rule set and doesn't go into Portal in terms of blending out different experiences or messing with things. Whilst we do know that you will be able to host experiences in Portal and they will be able to collect experience and be official experiences if you don't go too far with rule sets, just having this in a separate menu makes no sense to me. It would make more sense to have a default matchmaking system followed up by a server browser, which was then split into official and portal-based experiences. Right now, we're going to have matchmaking and then portal, which is split into official and portal-based experiences, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. Considering there doesn't seem to be skill-based matchmaking, and considering that there doesn't seem to be a specific goal behind their matchmaking, the idea that they just don't do a server browser makes no sense to me. Call of Duty, for example, would never do a server browser because it would completely defeat the skill-based experiences that they aim for and how they sort of try to keep players playing again by putting them in the worst possible experiences. But with Battlefield 6, that doesn't seem to be the case, so it kind of seems like a PR open goal to release with a server browser. You know, it won't be the end of the world if they don't drop without one, but it just feels like a universal win for everybody if they do. It's a universal win for EA and Battlefield because most people will happily pay them to host their own servers. It's a win for pretty much everybody in the community who wants persistent experiences. It's a win for the average player because they can actually play the experiences that they want to play. There's just a lot of questions here. If I'm working at EA or DICE right now, I'm looking at the current situation with matchmaking and going, this is good, and it's working, for the most part, minus some gripes that I've just explained, but we can literally score a colossal win with the entire FPS gaming audience by simply saying, do what you want. Have a server browser. Here you go. You keep asking us. Have fun. Battlefield Portal experiences being hosted completely for free is fantastic, and it is something that I think is an incredible industry standard that pretty much no other game does. That being said, most of us would be okay if we could rent a server from EA. It was something that existed before, it's something that we used to do through third parties. You know, they're not being anti-consumer by doing that as a practice. Let's move on to the map experience in the Battlefield 6 beta. Now, I do think it's a really big shame to not have a big map experience in Battlefield 6 in the beta. The largest map that is available is Liberation Peak, and honestly, I would consider this to be a medium-minus map at best. And this is something that I have relayed to Battlefield as early as January of this year, and even before then. It seems to me that Battlefield is focusing on having a specific time to engagement time, and what I mean by that is that they don't want you sitting around with loads of dead air in every single game, and certain maps and experiences are clearly being catered towards a certain degree of chaos. Now, that's okay, and we know, for example, that Siege of Cairo, Iberian Offensive, and Liberation Peak are considered to be small to medium-small maps, and they have been described as small mountain ranges, a close-quarters map, and a dense urban map. The flip side of this, unfortunately, is that the larger maps which exist in the game, like Manhattan Bridge, Mirak Valley, New Sobek City, and also Operation Firestorm, where downtime is going to be something that you can have in-game, simply aren't in the beta. Some of that is probably EA and DICE trying to appeal to a larger array of FPS fans and show them that Battlefield 6 can be engaging, chaotic, and fun, and honestly, Siege of Cairo I consider to be an S-tier map, and when you guys get to play Empire State as well, I also consider that to be an S-tier map. So having those intense infantry experiences with the odd spattering of vehicles to introduce fans to the series seems like a win. Also, chances are these are the smaller maps that are available in the game, and they are probably the most finished as a result of that because they require less work. So it just seems like a bit of a miss to not have at least one big map available. I feel like it makes a lot of us feel like it is just this overall intense experience from start to finish. You get a little bit of downtime in Conquest and Liberation Peak and Siege of Cairo, but for the most part, it's still pretty intensive and it's still kind of in your face, kind of chaotic. So having maps like Mirak Valley and Operation Firestorm, where there will be open spaces, downtime isn't a dirty word, and you actually can have a bit of a rest in between gunfights and pushing for objectives, is something that's going to be welcomed. I would say for Battlefield 6, though, that Siege of Cairo, Iberian Offensive, Liberation Peak, Empire State, and also Saints Quarter are small to medium-small maps. So it's really essential that Operation Firestorm, New Sobek City, Mirak Valley, and Manhattan Bridge are actually larger experiences, and we need variety very early on. Having half of your maps be this sort of, Grand Bazaar-esque scale size, which is what I would consider Siege of Cairo to be, and to some extent Liberation Peak is somewhat reminiscent of one of the more Battlefield Bad Company 2 Conquest maps, we're kind of missing the bigger picture in terms of slightly larger scale combined arms experiences. And at launch, that's going to be fine. It seems to be sort of hitting around the 50-50 mark for larger combined arms / mostly close quarters chaotic experiences. But in the long run, I do feel like straight away in Season 1, we need to see at least one other large map very early on. Downtime is not a bad word in Battlefield. Having a specific time to engagement isn't necessarily a bad thing, but can create very samey experiences. Siege of Cairo, for example, despite being radically different to Empire State in terms of setting and scenery, will probably end up feeling fairly similar for most people. That being said, what I will do is give credit to the team. Siege of Cairo and Empire State are S-tier maps. They are fantastic Battlefield maps that I think will be fan favorites in the future of this franchise. As for Liberation Peak and Iberian Offensive, meh. Iberian Offensive is okay. It's got some interesting sort of infantry dynamics of moving building to building, which I think is quite cool. Liberation Peak, however, I just don't really know what this map is supposed to be. I don't think it plays well in Conquest. I don't think it plays well in Breakthrough. And Breakthrough is another discussion we will be having entirely in the next part of this video. But it just feels as though this map is like a camper's sniper's paradise. Having a gigantic hill in the middle of the map just seems like a pretty bad idea, which is a shame because the actual objective points themselves, the F objective, for example, and the D objective, are actually really well designed and lots of fun. It's just a shame that there seems to be this sniper's paradise in the middle of it, and then on top of that, you've also got C, which is buried in this sort of U-turn bend, which obviously is a choke point and is a lot of fun to play in, but having that in a height-based experience, just a lot of questions with this map. I honestly feel like this map would benefit from expanding to the other side of the river that is available, adding an objective somewhere out there to pull some of the attention away from the C objective and that height terrain, or potentially just giving people more distance from the gigantic hillscape. All of the objectives are in a direct line of sight to that hill, so it feels like you are constantly being sniped by some kind of sniper, some kind of vehicle camped up on the side of the hill, and pulling away another objective into a different location to create more distance feels like a very healthy change for this map that should be explored. If you could essentially move the D objective slightly so it's in line with C, and then add a further objective out in the distance somewhere either across the river or even further up the hill on C, you would make a slightly larger experience that would feel less like you're basically fish in a barrel for 90% of the game. I told the developers back in January that I do not have a lot of love for what is Liberation Peak and used to be called Capstone, and whilst it certainly has improved from what I played and can be considered to be quite fun in some vehicle scenarios, I still don't consider it to be a good map. Moving on to Breakthrough. Good God. Now, the modes, honestly, in this game mode are not really worth discussing. Conquest is Conquest, it feels fantastic. I was a little bit disappointed, actually, to see that King of the Hill was not a larger 32-player mode. I think that's a mistake, having King of the Hill being like an 8v8 mode. Seems like a mistake, you know, just something to consider, devs. A larger King of the Hill variant seems to make sense in my head. Rush is Rush, and I'm looking forward to trying that on the next weekend. But Breakthrough. Good God. I don't know what happened to Breakthrough, but it is, quite frankly, one of the worst Breakthrough experiences I have played so far. Honestly, there are some very easy fixes for this. To start with, just completely remove the first objective on Liberation Peak. It's basically completely impossible to capture, and trying to get people to cross the equivalent of a no man's land to get to the first objective makes no sense to me. Siege of Cairo. Why the defenders have any kind of IFV vehicle is the largest head-scratching question mark I've ever had in my entire adult experience. And C, and arguably the biggest problem, why are the attackers allowed so far into the defender's spawn? This makes no sense to me. Like, I was able to put basically the equivalent of a spawn beacon within 5 feet of where these guys were spawning in. And if I don't think I lost a defensive round. I just want to point that out. I think out of the 38.5 hours I've played of Battlefield 6, I maybe lost 1 defensive round. Like, I'm sure they're going to have data to show that this has been incredibly one-sided towards the defenders across the board. But just some of the objective designs on this are hideous. Like, you know, we're talking straight choke points. We're talking, you know, just absolutely zero chance for the attacking team to get any kind of a foothold on these maps. And it would be fascinating to see what the actual data does look like from their end, because at least in my experience, if you were on defense, you won. We actually made a joke called Never End on Defend, because it was basically just free kills for fun. Siege of Cairo feels a little bit more fixable, something I have discussed very much in the extent of this video that you'll see in the vehicle section, is that I have no understanding why the entire team can spawn on an IFV. It should be a squad-based vehicle only, and having your entire team capable of spawning on an infantry fighting vehicle completely ruins the flow of breakthrough and needs to be completely removed from the game. You know, you can literally capture an objective and then the enemy IFV rolls up and it's like, bang, sweet, all of a sudden there are 16 players here. It's completely flow breaking and completely ruined the Siege of Cairo breakthrough in my experience, especially on the attacking side of things, where the defenders just randomly roll up an IFV and then completely ruin anything that you achieved in the last 5 minutes. As for Liberation Peak, just go completely back to the drawing board, dude. Like that first objective has to go. It just needs either complete redesigning or just needs to be completely removed entirely. Like, I think it kind of alludes to the biggest flaws of Liberation Peak, just the fact that the entire hillside is this open range that doesn't seem to make any sense or benefit anybody on the map, and it's why I don't really like the map as a whole. Next up, let's talk about the class system. Now, I'm going to be entirely honest, I didn't hate the open class system as much as I thought I would. I think the problem with that is that the general experience was so chaotic that it didn't really matter, and in some of the larger maps where your sort of decision-making feels a bit more important, these issues will shine through a fair bit. Now, there are some things that are just flat-out broken that are already being amended. I've alluded to the engineer having both a stinger and an RPG being insane, and that isn't something that is going to happen at release. My issue with the open system is that it basically just feels as though I, as a skillful player, or even just I as a terrible person and human being, can just take the best of any class, manipulate it with the best possible weapon, and create the worst possible gameplay experiences with no drawbacks. Whether that's sniping on the hill with a redeploy beacon, which, despite being moved to assault, you'll still be able to use a sniper, which kind of defeats the purpose of that change. Or, and arguably probably one of the biggest issues, I was essentially being a combat recon. I don't actually think I strayed from this role a lot. I was putting spawn beacons essentially in people's faces, spawning in with either an assault rifle, a carbine, or something of that demeanor, and just utterly rinsing them. Now, granted, carbines will be available regardless, even if they do decide to close the system, but it just felt as though, to me, there was no balance here. There was no semblance of balance in the entire beta experience. There was no identifiable way for me to identify if somebody was a threat, if they had C4 for my vehicle, if they had an RPG for my vehicle. It was difficult to identify in combat situations if somebody had a certain arsenal or skill set available to them, and the only real thing that made me change how I approached a gunfight was seeing a sniper glint. It just feels as though, to me right now, the whole system just feels messy. It feels like in Battlefield 6 there are no drawbacks to any approach I do, where I can just kind of become a one-man army and I can just utterly mow people down. It's just not great. Having this sort of open system where anyone can do anything, anybody can have any kind of arsenal, anybody can have any kind of equipment set up, just feels kind of backward at this point in time. It feels like, as an engineer, for example, I can run around with an assault rifle and have the best of both worlds. I can be anti-vehicle, anti-people, and pretty much do whatever I want. As a recon, I can literally do whatever I want, and I have a respawn beacon to make people's lives substantially worse. And it feels like I witness a future in the future coming where I'm going to be sitting in a larger scale map, and it's going to be impossible to identify threats around me because, you know, I'm going to be seeing sniper rifles and guys who are, I think, recon players using RPGs, and that's going to be a complete throw-off for my gameplay. Or if I see full auto from somebody who is a recon and actually did place a redeploy beacon, but I didn't even think to look for it or be aware of it, or think that there might be a UAV above me because he was full autoing me at range. One of the other things I'm not a huge fan of is that they had the closed conquest behind the open conquest. And that's a real problem for me because I feel as though this UI decision, where the first thing on your page is regular conquest, and the second thing on your page is the closed system, is going to create inherent bias amongst new players. Yes, of course, conquest, regular, and open is going to be more played. Why? Because average players are going to click the first thing that's there, not the second thing. So if they try to use data from this beta to justify keeping classes open at the launch of this game, I feel like they've already created some sort of invalidation just from the bias of how the UI is structured. Right now, it just feels like I'm running against 32 different soldiers. I don't know what the hell they have in their arsenal. They could have C4, they could have rockets, they could have things that blow me up. The silhouettes to these characters aren't particularly clear. The equipment that they could have on them is not clear at all. And it just doesn't feel balanced. It doesn't feel like Battlefield. And as much fun as I had in the Battlefield 6 beta, I feel like even if you decide to keep this future with restricted and open, that's fine. Just don't bury one of them in the menus. Let's talk about gunplay. Now, I have playtested Battlefield 6 beyond the beta that you guys have played, often in experiences where a larger toolset is available in terms of equipment, attachments, grenades, etc. And my biggest concern going into Battlefield 6 is explosive spam, and that shouldn't shock anybody. The amount of explosive spam in the beta alone was already pretty high. Now, grenades aren't a huge issue and they actually feel fairly balanced. You have a good amount of time to react to them, but there are a couple of things that need to be looked at here. A, please do not add any more explosive equipment to this game. Other than obviously things that engineers need to take out vehicles, there is no reason why I should have 3 different kinds of grenade launcher firing at my head. There should be no reason why I have an airburst firing at me. There should be no reason why mortars are going to be taking over the place. Mortars I can maybe forgive, considering it's something that's been in the franchise for quite some time, but as it is, it's already too much. As it is, it's already enough. You already die more to indirect random explosive fire than you do to pretty much anything else. Now, the grenade launcher incendiary rounds has to go. Like this grenade launcher that not only does fire damage and a base damage of like 80 or something insane like that, but also stuns you and stops you from moving. Absolutely insane, shouldn't be in Battlefield at all. So whatever the next step is for the beta and the future of this game, please, DICE, please do not make the same mistake you make every single game, where it launches with 75 layers of explosive spam, and then you have to start scaling it back. There are so many other pieces of useful equipment and things that could be added to the game that don't require us strapping explosives to them that would make a massive improvement to Battlefield 6, and the combat ladder is a great example of that. Now, as for the actual gunplay itself, it's actually incredibly close to Battlefield 4, as is the movement. You can see a like-for-like comparison on Reddit. I'll pop it up on screen for now, but the TTK is pretty much close to identical, if not a little bit too fast, and also on top of that, the movement speed is essentially the same. The only difference being that the maps in Battlefield 6 that we have played so far are significantly smaller. Recoil on weapons is already getting a pass, and seeing that slightly bumped up is going to be good for the game. But the actual core mechanics of how these guns work in terms of spread, dispersion, crouching, standing, and prone having an impact on your gunplay, moving and shooting having the impact on your gunplay, is pretty much identical to Battlefield 4. So if you're somebody who has played BF4 before, you know burst fire is king over range, and you also know that going crouching or stopping moving while shooting can greatly improve your overall spread and accuracy. There are a couple of issues with the gunplay. To start with, time to kill, as I've mentioned, is getting a pass, as is recoil, and that's something that I'm glad to see. But there is a big disparity in the game right now between time to kill and time to death. The time to kill for this game feels slightly okay, if not just slightly off. A little bit longer and it'll be pretty much in a sweet spot, but the time to death can sometimes feel instantaneous. Now, there is a bug in the game right now where the first few bullets of damage you take don't actually show up with the audible visual feedback that you're taking damage, which is likely part of the equation here. But I've noticed, despite the fact that this game seemingly is very clearly running 60Hz servers, there still seems to be some instances where you're dying really, really fast, but the time it takes you to actually kill somebody feels a lot more natural. This time to kill and time to death disparity is something that has existed in previous Battlefields and been resolved, so I'm hopeful this is something that will be fixed before the release of the game. My biggest issue with the gunplay actually boils down to a couple of things that I think are very fixable. The first one is that there is a lot of random bobbing when you go over certain types of terrain, and in fact, it's almost like your entire character drops 5 feet when he falls off of a 1 centimeter ledge, and this can completely put your crosshair and gunplay completely off. So that's something that needs resolving, and it was something that was so incredibly frequent that I just ended up getting used to it despite it being really annoying. The next is auto-spotting. I feel like the auto-spotting system in this game is far too strong, and I've had a number of instances where somebody has been hidden in a bush. I actually haven't seen them personally, and I just end up deleting them because a random red dot appears over their head. So changing the range of that and the frequency that it shows up on, whether somebody's in a smoke grenade or hidden in some kind of cover, feels like something that's really important to the gunplay situation for this game to create more balance and create more downtime as well, because inadvertently people are being shot more because they're being randomly spotted more. And the final issue I have with Gunplay is the penetration values on some static items are completely busted. Like, I had a wooden table that I fired at where I did basically no damage to the person on the other side of it. The same has happened with plastic chairs. Random bits of bushes and foliage can sometimes exhibit the same issues. So a full pass on penetrative values for different types of materials is definitely something that has to happen in this game. The firing range was really nice to have, a really great positive. The gunplay I generally enjoyed, and if we could see a more expanded fire range that allows you to do a few more things, a few more tweaks, maybe even an aim trainer in there. I'm sure these things will exist in Portal anyway, but it would be nice to have them just in the default game. And also, having a firing range for vehicles would be greatly appreciated. Letting people practice in the tanks that they're using, letting people practice in helicopters and jets, whilst also being able to change and customize what those vehicles are using would be fantastic for Battlefield 6. This technically isn't gunplay related, but it is death related in Battlefield 6, I guess. Passive fire. This is something that we got done away with in sort of Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5, where if you step on something that's on fire, you catch fire. Now, yes, cool, looks great, visually, makes sense, somewhat realistic. Maybe just make it so that it doesn't completely instantly chalk your health, because I've had a couple of occasions where I'm a little bit low on health and I step on a bit of fire and boom, I'm dead. And I really don't want that to happen again. It was really frustrating in old Battlefields. Like, it can just be a visual effect with like one tick of damage instead of being, you know, a serious effect that's clearly going to kill you. Obviously, for certain objects that are meant to explode or meant to catch fire, those things should deal damage, like pipelines, canisters, cars that detonate for the first time. But if those things continue to burn to increase the atmosphere of the game, they shouldn't deal loads of damage to people who happen to just randomly stumble into them. The final thing is vehicles, and this is a place that I think Battlefield 6 needs a lot of work. Helicopters in this game are cheeks. There is no other way of describing them. When you fly an attack helicopter in Battlefield 4, I would liken it to flying an SUV. You know it's a little bit bulky, but you know what you can get out of it, and critically in Battlefield 4, when you accelerate and decelerate, you almost feel the weight of the vehicle, and you know what kind of turns and maneuvers that you can pull off because of that. You know, there's this real sort of sense of physicality to those helicopters, and they really feel attached to your input method, which is really, really important. And then on top of that, they're just quite responsive. They respond to your inputs incredibly well, and something I've mentioned for controller players is that by default, out of the box, they absolutely should be binding accelerate and decelerate to the triggers, not to the analog sticks. That's such a strange decision in my opinion. But if Battlefield 4 is like driving an SUV in the sky, I would liken Battlefield 6 to flying a bus. Like, it's slow, it doesn't respond to you properly, it takes ages to accelerate or decelerate. You know, trying to get close maneuvers on the ground is incredibly challenging. And all of this is compounded by the fact that the average helicopter in this game can only survive one stinger on full health. So if you happen to be beyond full health or in a situation where you've taken a little bit of light damage elsewhere, which you probably will considering this thing has the turning circle of a Volkswagen van, then you find yourself in a pretty tricky situation. I really just feel like helicopters need to go back to the drawing board. I actually enjoyed the jet experience. I'm not the most jet player focused guy. You'd have to speak to somebody like Silk. But for the most part, jets felt responsive. They felt fantastic. They felt like the acceleration and deceleration mattered. It felt like you could get to where you needed to be. It felt just impactful. But helicopters literally felt like I was driving like the equivalent of my nan's van in the sky. You know, it's not that sleek experience you're looking for. It's not the responsive experience you're looking for. I know Little Birds and maybe the Chinook are going to have entirely separate profiles and feel very different. But the physics in helicopters right now, despite looking very cool, especially in terms of how they crash and how they explode, just aren't fun. That's the way I would describe it. And I had some great helicopter games. I've had entire helicopter rounds on Liberation Peak where I did not die once because of intelligent use of flares countering stingers, diving in between cliffs and valleys, and even so, I would consider the helicopters in this game to be insufferable. As for the ground vehicles, the biggest surprise is arguably the cars. The cars are really responsive and really fun to use. That's a random W I wasn't expecting. But the IFVs and also the tanks are very problematic. Now, I've touched on this before, but I'm going to say it again. The entire team should not be able to spawn on IFVs and tanks. It should be squad mates only. It completely ruins the flow of some objectives in this game. But as for the actual physicality of these vehicles, there's just a few things that don't make sense to me. IFVs and tanks in this game seemingly get stuck on everything, literally everything, despite the fact that they are, multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment that are designed to scale literally the side of a cliff at 90 miles an hour if they need to. But it just feels slow, sluggish, unresponsive, often getting stuck on small bits of terrain, minor hills. It feels like you sometimes even slide backwards on hills, which is really annoying. And that just shouldn't be the case in Battlefield 6. All of them need to be faster, a little bit more responsive. They need to not have these issues with terrain where they're getting stuck on things or being forced to slow down. They should be what they are, which is fast vehicles, powerful, impactful. And the reality is, it takes 3 or so RPGs or 4 well-placed C4s, and you're pretty much dead anyway. The turret turning speed as well is also super sluggish, which is a balancing feature of course, but it's still too slow. I'm not saying it should be lightning fast, but it should be faster than what it currently is, especially when it's so easy for infantry to currently counter vehicles. So in terms of IFVs and tanks, it's literally a combination of making them more mobile and making them more enjoyable and less frustrating where they're getting stuck on things, getting clipped into things. Oh, and one thing that is definitely upsetting that absolutely fundamentally has to change Battlefield. I fired at a helicopter with a tank shell. The first one dusted. The second one only did 80 damage. It didn't one-shot a helicopter. Now, part of that is because helicopters clearly fly like buses in the sky and aren't mobile enough to dodge these things. So I get it in terms of balancing it. But 2, if you take away tank heli sniping from Battlefield, I am going to be upset. That is something that has existed in every Battlefield game, and it should exist in every single Battlefield game. And the final thing, let me launch my damn vehicle in the sky with some C4. Come on, Battlefield. We're playing Battlefield. C4 launching's a classic. How am I meant to get clips and rinse them on TikTok? Gosh. No, it's just a classic fan staple. Launching a tank into the sky is funny as hell. And I hope they bring it back to the franchise. This video arguably ended up being far too long at 36 minutes, but thank you very much for watching this. I hope you guys have some interesting thoughts and feelings on Battlefield 6, and let me know in the comment section down below. Please do subscribe as well. We're on the road to 200k, and I'll catch you again in the next one.